All right. So, our verse today is chapter 1, text 2. So, I assume either you all have a book open or open to some appropriate electronic device here. Okay, so here's the purport in English by Prabhupada. Dhritarashtra was blind from birth. Unfortunately, he was also bereft of spiritual vision. He knew very well that his sons were equally blind in the matter of religion. And he was sure that they could never reach an understanding with the Pandavas, who were all pious since birth. Since he was doubtful about the influence of the place of pilgrimage, and Sanjaya could understand his motive in asking about the situation on the... Still, he was doubtful about the influence of the place of pilgrimage, and Sanjaya could understand his motive in asking about the situation on the battlefield. Sanjaya wanted, therefore, to encourage the despondent king and thus assure him that his sons were not going to make any sort of compromise in the influence of the holy place. Sanjaya therefore informed the king that his son Duryodhana, after seeing the military force of the Pandavas, at once went to the commander-in-chief Dronacharya to inform him of the real position. Although Duryodhana is mentioned as the king, he still had to go through the commander on account of the seriousness of the situation. He was therefore quite fit to be a politician. But Duryodhana's diplomatic veneer could not disguise the fear he felt when he saw the military arrangement of the Pandavas. Sanjaya uvacha dristvatu pandavani kang vyudham Duryodhanas tada acharyam upasangamya Raja Vachanam Abravit. Sanjaya said, O king, after looking over the army arranged in military formations by the son of Pandu, King Duryodhana went to his teacher and spoke the following words. So, this is the Bhagavad-gita, and here Atma and company have just finished going through the entire Bhagavad-gita verse by verse, and it took them only 9 years to do it, and we are beginning again right at the very beginning. So this is a great time to kind of give a lot of overview about what the Bhagavad-gita is and how it is arranged. The Bhagavad-gita is about 700 verses in 18 chapters. Most chapters have somewhere between 20 and 40 verses. But there are two that I call double wides, chapter 2 and chapter 18. The second and the last chapter, both of those are about twice as big as any of the other chapters. And both of them are twice as big because they are summary chapters. They actually kind of summarize the Bhagavad-gita. So the Bhagavad-gita follows that interesting structure that speakers should do. Generally, the speaker should announce what he or she will talk about, then talk about it, and then review what they just talked about. So as they say, you tell people what you're going to tell them, and then you tell them, and then you tell them what you just told them. So this is Bhagavad-gita. It has these summary verses at the very beginning, at the very end. And it's divided into 3 sections, each of about 6 chapters in length. So the first 6 chapters are kind of the overview of all the yoga systems and all the spiritual approaches that Krishna goes over with Arjuna to kind of get Arjuna on the same page. Then the next 6 chapters, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12, those chapters describe actually bhakti yoga out of all the various types of yoga processes. Krishna will ultimately tell Arjuna that what he should do is not worry about all the others, but do what's called bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion. And then from 13 on through 18, the last 6 chapters, Krishna will just give some more details using some of the techniques and various metaphors in the other yoga systems to explain how bhakti yoga works. So that's kind of the overall drift of Bhagavad-gita. The first 6 chapters are a review of all the different Vedic approaches, all the different kinds of yoga and other Vedic approaches. Then the middle 6 chapters are about the process of bhakti itself directly. And then the last ones use some of the metaphors and systems in the other types of yoga to explain how to practice bhakti yoga. So Bhagavad-gita is really about bhakti yoga. It is not, as sometimes it is presented by certain speakers, it is not a grab bag of many possibilities and you can take your choice. Certainly Krishna does talk about jnana yoga, raja yoga, karma yoga, stanga yoga, dhyana yoga. He talks about all these different things. He certainly does. But at the end of chapter 6, he kind of makes it clear that he wants Arjuna to be a yogi, which is the next to the last verse in chapter 6. And then the very last verse, he explains what kind of yogi he wants Arjuna to be. Madgatena antaratmana. So he wants him to always think of Krishna, to be a yogi who is fixed on the Supreme, which is a bhakti yogi. So although Krishna may talk about all these other various types of yoga, it's not that he's recommending all in any of them. He's recommending a particular one. Now, why does Krishna talk about all these different kinds of other yogas with Arjuna if he's only really going to recommend one? And the answer is so that, as I put it, he and Arjuna will be on the same page when Krishna actually starts talking about bhakti yoga. They need to be on the same page. If Krishna just immediately launches into talking about bhakti yoga, Arjuna will ask questions like, well, what about raja yoga? Well, what about, shouldn't I be meditating? He'll ask questions like that. And so instead of doing that, Krishna preempts all that by just talking about all that stuff first. And then at the very end, he says, okay, now we've talked about this meditational process. We've talked about this process of doing karma yoga. We've talked about these other kinds of yogas, of various kinds of physical yoga. Now, after talking about this, this is what I want you to do. These other things exist. They're part of the Vedic system, but that's not what I want you to do. This is what I want you to do. So that's kind of why the first 6 chapters are there. And if you have ever read or have come across Bhagavad-gitas that are written or described by other authors other than A.C. Bhaktivedanta, you will discover that there's a whole group of different kinds of explanations. And in each case, you will discover that the Bhagavad-gita will not shine all the way through. There'll be parts of it that make clear sense, and there'll be parts of it that don't make any sense at all. And this is because most of these other presenters will present Bhagavad-gita out of its real context. Now, Prabhupada, one time, when he was first here in New York, his first few months in New York City, when he had just come from India, he was giving classes in, various different places, uptown and around different places. And I think he gave a class at, what do they call that organization that started by Madame Blavatsky? I can't think of it right now. What's that?
Theosophy?
Theosophy, right. He gave a class at a Theosophy Society. And a lady asked him if he could recommend a Bhagavad-gita for her to read because he was talking about Bhagavad-gita. And that was before Prabhupada had actually presented his own Bhagavad-gita in English. And he told her that actually he could not. And at that time, there were some 600 versions of Bhagavad-gita in existence, and he couldn't recommend a single one of them. And that was because the author, or the person who had translated it, was really only using the Bhagavad-gita to showcase his own philosophy. So if you are using the Bhagavad-gita to showcase your own philosophy, it will work. Bhagavad-gita has its own philosophy. It doesn't need someone to come up with a new philosophy and use Bhagavad-gita to twist it and bounce it off Bhagavad-gita. That's not the way you actually explain Bhagavad-gita. So if Bhagavad-gita is presented as an explanation of bhakti, you'll see all 18 chapters will make perfect sense, and the whole thing will actually be really straightforward. If you don't see it in the light of bhakti yoga, it will not do that. And as I've said before, I'm sorry for some of you who have probably heard some of my examples numerous times, but for instance, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi did a version of Bhagavad Gita, only the first 6 chapters. What happened to 7 to 18? He said that he would get around to translating those into English, but sadly he's no longer with us, so we assume he's never going to get around to doing that. And why would he do that? Well, because chapter 6 talks about the yoga of meditation. That was what he was all about, meditation. If you go on beyond 6, you get into bhakti yoga, and he didn't want to go there, so he just left it out. And as I've said before, many years ago, I spent a winter, a nice blissful winter in the windy city of Chicago. And it was ridiculously cold here, as it always is in Chicago in the winter. And I got off the subway platform in Rogers Park, where we have our temple in Chicago. And below the subway, there was a bookstore. And I went in, I thought, wow, so I'll get warm in here. I'll walk into the bookstore. I went in there for a little while. And as I was looking through the books, I saw Bhagavad-gita As It Was. And, Prabhupada, he titled his Bhagavad-gita As It Is. So someone called another Bhagavad-gita, one of their copies or their explanations, Bhagavad-gita As It Was. And this one went to, I think, chapter 9 or something like that. And then, what happened to the rest of it? So, again, you have this idea of somebody trying to present their own message through Bhagavad-gita, and Bhagavad-gita here is serving only as a sounding board. But the Bhagavad-gita has its own message. It doesn't need someone to speak for it, or to twist it through, or to bend it into a different shape. And if you actually explain it the way it's designed as an explanation of bhakti yoga, it makes perfect sense. All the pieces work together. You don't have to leave parts of it out. It's all there. So Bhagavad Gita has 700 verses, and it really is an explanation of bhakti yoga. And it comes out of a larger work. Many of you may know the Bhagavad Gita is just one chapter. It's just one chapter of a larger book called the Mahabharata. Mahabharata has only a mere 200,000 verses. So Bhagavad Gita is 700, and the Mahabharata is 200,000 verses. So it's huge. And it's the whole story of not only the Pandavas and their battle against the Kauravas, but of the kings that came before. We hear about Shantanu, and we hear about Mahabhisha, and we hear about Maharaj Pratipa, and all these kings that came before the Pandavas. And we eventually lead up to the Kauravas and the Pandavas and their birth, and how the Pandavas were the rightful heirs of the throne, and the Kauravas were not. However, the Kauravas had, by their own political expertise, usurped the throne, and the Pandavas were pushed out. And this went on for a long time And eventually we come to the stage where the Pandavas lost their kingdom due to a gambling match that was staged between the Kauravas and the Pandavas, Duryodhana and Yudhishthira. Yudhishthira was the eldest of the Pandavas, and Duryodhana was the eldest of the Kauravas. And in that gambling match, Yudhishthira lost everything because Duryodhana was using crooked dice. He had some dice that would roll the way he wanted them to roll. And so therefore, he won their entire kingdom and even won their wife. But Duryodhana's father, Dhritarashtra, he turned it all around. He gave Draupadi, who was the wife, the common wife of all the Pandavas, a chance to rectify the situation. She asked for the kingdoms to be given back to her husbands and asked for them to be freed again, which Duryodhana's father Dhritarashtra granted. But they played one more game, and this game was that if the Pandavas won, they would get the entire kingdom, and if they lost, then they would have to go into exile for 13 years. So again, the same crooked dice were used, and they lost, and they had to go into exile for 13 years. And the idea was that after the end of those 13 years, they could come back out of exile, and they could reclaim the kingdom that had been theirs, at least a portion of it. Of course, what would happen was that Duryodhana had no intention of ever giving them back any portion, however small, of the kingdom. And this led to a battle. The Pandavas didn't even want to engage in the battle to reclaim their kingdom. And as we see, Bhagavad-gita starts when this battle is just about to take place. The battle is literally an hour or two away from starting. A monumental battle between two huge armies involving millions of people. And just before the battle starts, Arjuna decides that maybe the battle should not be fought at all. And so the Bhagavad-gita in 30 minutes of real time is spoken by Krishna on the battlefield. So Krishna is there with Arjuna, and Krishna speaks the entire Bhagavad-gita in about 30-45 minutes. And in this time, Arjuna goes from verse 2:9, which he says, Govinda, I shall not fight, to verse 18:73, where he says, now my consciousness is cleared, and I'm prepared to act according to your instructions. So from chapter 2.9, where Arjuna is leaving the decision up to Krishna. He's throwing himself at Krishna's feet and saying, I'm not sure what to do, you tell me. But at any rate, I'm sure I'm not going to fight. That's how Arjuna presents it. And later on, just as the Bhagavad-gita is ending in chapter 18, verse 73, there Arjuna says, now I am freed from doubt, and I will act according to your instructions. So he decides to fight. So something that Krishna has said in those chapters in between has changed Arjuna's consciousness, has changed his mind. So the Bhagavad-gita is like a bridge. The Bhagavad-gita is like a transition. The Bhagavad-gita is like a journey. And it journeys through all these different things. We follow in the Bhagavad-gita the journey of Arjuna from a confused soldier to someone who is resolute and understands why the why the battle of Kurukshetra is being fought. So the battle is fought not just because some kings want to be in possession of great territory and therefore have political power. That's not the reason the Bhagavad-gita is actually spoken, and it's not the reason that the Battle of Kurukshetra is fought. The Battle of Kurukshetra is fought because Duryodhana, although a capable politician and even a quite capable soldier himself, is completely deaf about spiritual affairs. So a rule under Duryodhana, though it might be politically somewhat stable, would be a rule where the people would not make any spiritual progress. Whereas a rule under the Pandavas would not be like that, because Yudhisthira was not only politically capable, he was not only a strong soldier himself from a physical point of view as a warrior, but he was also spiritually capable. So he knew how to rule, and he knew what to do, and he knew why to do it, and the people under the rule of Yudhisthira would actually make spiritual progress. And this is what government really should do, should support. Of course, we live in a time where governments are so far away from anything that even resembles this, and it's really sad. But at any rate, that's actually the idea. The government is supposed to support spiritual development for the individual people involved in the administration of that government. At any rate, we see that the battle is fought. And so the Bhagavad-gita is one chapter out of these 200,000 verses of Mahabharata, which take the whole story from the very beginning, where we discover the various kings and princes and the line that leads up to the birth of Pandu, and then the birth of the Pandavas and the birth of the Kauravas, the fight, and then eventually what happens after the fight and how the Pandavas rule, and eventually how they turn over the kingdom to the one remaining heir of the Pandava line, which is Parikshit, and then they themselves march into the Himalayas and leave their bodies. So this is the Mahabharata, the whole overall story. So the overall story of Mahabharata has all these different parts, and the Bhagavad-gita is like the diamond or the setting, the ring within a precious ring. It's the jewel within the setting of a precious ring. So the reason that the Mahabharata is spoken, the reason it was created by Vyasadeva, was he could understand that people find philosophy very difficult. Especially in the age of Kali Yuga, we don't find philosophy very easy to absorb. So he understood that the way for people generally to absorb philosophy is through a narrative, through a story. And so through the telling of Mahabharata, we have things that people are interested in. People might not be so interested in spiritual life, but they certainly are interested in war. And they certainly are interested in political intrigues. They certainly are interested in romance. Every Broadway play, every modern film has plenty of these themes, and they're always sellouts. Everybody's always interested in these kind of themes. So humans have always been interested in these kind of things. So through the telling of a great epic of many generations and wars and intrigue and so forth, we are finally, in a certain point, we come face to face with Bhagavad-gita, which is actually the real purpose of the entire Mahabharata. And that's why it's seen as a separate work. Even though it's just a chapter of a larger work, the Bhagavad-gita comes out of the Mahabharata like a diamond set in the ring. The Mahabharata is the ring, the gold, the nice setting, but it's really the diamond that gives it the main focus. And it's really the philosophy of the Bhagavad-gita, which is what the Mahabharata is trying to deliver. And the rest of it is the kind of thing that brings a person to study the entire Mahabharata just to come to, at some point, coming across the philosophy in Bhagavad-gita. So at any rate, this is why the Bhagavad-gita is important, And as we said a minute ago, the Bhagavad-gita is like a transition. The Bhagavad-gita is spiritual life in a nutshell. Prabhupada described that the Bhagavad-gita is like the ABCs of spiritual life, whereas Srimad Bhagavatam is like the graduate study, and Chaitanya Charitamrita is like the postgraduate study of spiritual life. So Bhagavad-gita has, like as we just said, 700 verses. So it's like the basic stuff. Bhagavad-gita is a tough book in many ways because Krishna moves through so many categories so fast. He doesn't really explain anything in great detail. When you read Srimad Bhagavatam, which is another writing, it's not the Mahabharata, it's a different book. It's called Srimad Bhagavatam, and it's 17,000 verses. In Srimad Bhagavatam, these same spiritual items are unpacked and explained in much more detail. That's why when we read Bhagavad Gita, we see it in the backdrop of Srimad Bhagavatam, where these same spiritual topics are much more fleshed out. And that way we can see all the details of exactly how the three modes of nature work, about how reincarnation works, about how the soul goes from one lifetime to another, the nature of free will, what the demigods are, how the 4 varnas and 4 ashrams are designed, all these various separate subject matters. All these various separate subject matters are more detailed and given a lot more unpacking in Srimad Bhagavatam. But in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna just hits them very fast and moves on to the next subject. But at the end of it, at the end of Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna has changed his mind. At the end of Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna has gone from being confused, from being emotionally distraught, from being paralyzed psychologically, to being confirmed, to being convicted as what he's going to do, to being fully focused on fighting a battle. So this is the nature of true spiritual knowledge. When you run across true spiritual knowledge, it does change your consciousness. It changes your whole way of looking at things and your whole outlook on things. So I'm going to stop there and ask if there are any questions about any of that. And then if there's more time, we'll go on to further explanations about the verse here and the Bhagavad Gita in general. Anyone have any questions? Yeah, Lee.
At one point, you talked about briefly Duryodhana and his qualifications as far as being a ruler of the kingdom, and his ability to possibly lead politically, but not spiritually.
That's right.
Oftentimes, we're challenged on this idea of what is good and what is bad, what is spiritual, what is not. And someone might pose that perhaps Duryodhana was the good guy.
Right.
And not Dhritarashtra, but the Pandavas were the bad guys.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you tell who is spiritual or who is good and who is bad? What are the indicators?
That's an excellent question, actually, because people kind of think like this. And in our modern world, there is a movement or a trend called postmodernism, which basically throws out the idea that there's any absolute anything, that all views of the world are simply just views, that you can interpret things as you want. And actually, here in New York on Broadway, I think for several months, there was a version of Mahabharata that played on Broadway. I forget who it was that did the that version on Broadway, and it was an unusual Broadway drama because it actually went on for, like 20 hours or something like that. You had to see the whole play in installments because, that's the nature of the Mahabharata. You have this huge epic narrative. It's longer than the Iliad or the Odyssey or something like that. It's all these different things going on. So one time, one of the reporters who was doing interviews, they asked the various people who were playing the characters. They asked Karna, what do you think about your role? And the actor who was playing Karna said, well, I think Karna's completely misunderstood. I think he's the real hero. And certainly you can think that way. So this is the age-old question of interpretation. And it is true that you can interpret anything in any number of ways. And that's always possible, no matter what you're talking about, whether you're talking about a scientific paper, whether you're talking about an ancient scripture, whether you're talking about some kind of mathematical or philosophical idea put forward some years ago. Whatever it is, there's an interpretation. So what makes the difference? Well, what really makes a difference is although there are many interpretations, they are not equally viable. That although there are many different possible interpretations, they don't all work as well as one another. And if you have actually a reasonable and workable interpretation, then you can take that interpretation and run many situations through it, like a mathematical formula or a explanation, and it has a power to explain them. Whereas if you have an interpretation that actually does not really ring true to the reality at the base of everything, then you'll find you will not be able to do that. And that interpretation will lead you to make erroneous assumptions. It will lead you into conclusions that will not be able to be maintained. It will lead you into situations where you will not be happy. So ultimately, that's the benchmark, And with the Mahabharata, Duryodhana certainly had an interpretation of what was going on at his time. And in the Mahabharata, we're introduced to Duryodhana's view of everything. And Duryodhana's view is a view that would not strike us as unusual at all in the modern day. Duryodhana thought that, all these people are trying to become happy by getting their power and their position, and that's all I'm trying to do, which a lot of people in our modern day would say, well, that's pretty straight ahead. But that's not what the Mahabharata or the Vedas actually say, that certainly it appears in the world that we live that the goal of everything is to be materially happy. And the way we do that is we have a dream in the back of our mind of what it would take for us personally to be materially happy. And we work that dream through our days and nights. And eventually we find that we are frustrated. We come up with smoke and mirrors. We don't actually find anything substantial anywhere. But when we finally get to that realization, we just swap out a new dream and we go ahead and chase something else. And this is the nature of the material world we live in. You can have any number of dreams, and nobody's going to stop you or force you to have one dream or another. You can have whatever you want. But they're all just dreams, and they don't actually give you the real goods at any point. But the Vedas say, no, wake up from those dreams. The real purpose of life is to understand the supreme God, to understand who he is as a person, and to develop a relationship with him. And when you do that, you will be happy. And you will not live some kind of boring or repetitious life. You will actually be part of a drama that never ends. Part of a drama that's more than three-dimensional. It's fourth-dimensional. And this is the nature of real spiritual life. And so from Duryodhana's point of view, we see a world which will not actually make not Duryodhana happy, because Duryodhana's life doesn't end in a happy way. Nor does he achieve the supreme destination. He achieves some good destinations, but not the supreme destination. Whereas the Pandavas are on a very different road. And we can try the principles, the spiritual and philosophical principles that are given in Bhagavad-gita, and discover that they actually do work in our lives. So this is the benchmark of true philosophy, or a viable understanding, as opposed to a theoretical understanding or a misconstrued understanding, because the possibility of interpretation is always infinite. But the possibility of correct or of useful interpretations, it's not infinite. It usually boils down to one major one. Does that kind of answer your question? Yeah, Merlin.
I had a question, but this discussion raised another question, so I want to put that forward.
Okay.
In order to consider, well, maybe the Kurd was right, maybe it seems that you have to put aside one essential point, and Prabhupada brings that up in the preface or in the introduction, that is at least theoretically accept that Krishna is God. Mm-hmm. Because if you don't put aside the fact that Krishna is God, then in the discussion, it's hard to see how you can make, Duryodhana's side be right, because Krishna's urging something other than what Duryodhana wants.
Right.
So is that...
Yeah, that's another important point. Spiritual life is for people who are actually looking at something beyond the everyday mundane stuff. If you think that out there somewhere is the big apple that you just need to bite, and everything will be wonderful after you find it, if you think it's out there somewhere, you won't be happy in this room right now. And you'll be kind of half bored. But if you think that maybe that's a pie in the sky, it's not an apple, it's actually a pie in the sky, then you are, a actual real candidate for spiritual life. As I usually say, a wink is good as a nod to a blind horse, So if you think somewhere out there material life is possible, spiritual life will never make any sense to you. And it will not interest you even slightly. But at some point, in some way, through some series, usually of catastrophes, we come to the understanding that this dream we've been fed in television, in the magazines, on the internet, that out there somewhere is the gusto. Out there somewhere is the fields of plenty. Out there somewhere is the big rock candy mountain. Out there somewhere it's there. We just have to find it. And we've had this dream smashed in front of us time and time and time and time again. And finally we think, hey, maybe this is just... It never existed. Maybe this is just the game that material life has always played, and we always get whacked over the head until one day we think, oh, now I get it. It's a fraud. The whole thing's a fraud. And so what's real? And what's real is spiritual life. And once you do that, then you become interested in these other things, and usually not before, until you at least question the idea that material happipiness is out there for the taking. Until you question that idea, spiritual life doesn't seem at all interesting or even plausible or approachable at all. You just move on to the next thing. You move on to how you're going to get to the next stage of getting closer to the big apple that you particularly have chosen, the particular flavor of it that you want. So that's how I would put it, So many people believe that there is a God. God is understood in many ways, in many religions, under different names, etc., etc. So that's always been there. But God is God, and usually in most religions he's understood to be the source and center of everything. And even the idea is there that somehow we should serve him, but we don't feel so inclined to do that. And the reason we don't feel inclined to do that is because of that crazy dream that we carry around. You know, we think that one day we're going to find that material dream. If you think you're going to find it, go for it. You know, see how far it gets you. But this is what I'm saying between viable interpretations and interpretations that are pie in the sky. You know, a viable one means that if you follow it, your life will become clearer, like Arjuna's was. Your life will become focused. Your life will become happy. And you will actually benefit all those people around you, as opposed to a life where you become more dissolute, a life where you become more depressed, a life where people start to hate you, a life where you start to create problems for the world and for the ecology and everything. This is the natural outgrowth of a philosophy or a point of view that doesn't cut it. One of those unviable solutions to the explanation of everything.
And most theistic theologies want you to follow God's law out of fear, and which is also something that turns off a lot of people.
Right.
You know, I don't want to be beaten into what I'm supposed to do.
Well, yes, to some extent, Krishna gives us over to Maya. And Maya's whole story is what we've been talking about. Here's a sweet ball. Go for it. Whap! And we go, well, that wasn't supposed to happen. We were supposed to get the sweet ball. And Maya said, oh, yeah, I know. It's something weird. Don't worry about it. It's just a fluke. Try it again. Whap, whap. Why it happened again? No, I believe me, trust me, it won't happen a third time. You know, and we just do this over and over again, like the donkey following the carrot, and we never cotton on. And some people go through their whole life, you know, chasing one dream that never works out, and then another dream that never works out, and another dream that never works out, and they never realize that it's not them, and it's not that the gods are crazy. It's just it's never supposed to work out, because material happiness doesn't really exist. It exists on a very superficial level. And one day we realize what's really going on, and we start to turn our lives around. And that's when I say that we have the second big realization. After we have the realization the material world is a big billboard with no real product. You know, material world is a giant billboard with no real product. And after we come to that realization, we realize I was stupid going for this over and over again. Now I want to begin spiritual life. And then we discover, oh, but I'm a junkie. I've been doing this for lifetime and lifetime. Even though I know it's idiotic, I still want to do it, you know. So this is the idea of gradually engaging in what we call bhakti yoga, the spiritual process, engaging in the spiritual process. We go into spiritual rehab. Gradually we become unaddicted to the material world. We begin to see that there's nothing there that's really going to help us or do anything for us. And we see the spiritual life is actually the real deal. So in the beginning, we find that we have to struggle to bring ourselves into alignment. But the scriptures tell us that there's a point where it all flips around. We're actually, we like doing the right thing, and we're no longer attracted by the junky stuff of this material world. In the beginning, it's the other way around. We know what the right thing is, but we're not that keen on doing it. It's a struggle. And we see the junky stuff of this material world, but we're still attracted to it. But as the process of bhakti yoga goes on, that changes. It flips around. And we begin to realize that, wow, lo and behold, that we actually begin to like spiritual life, and we begin to find that the junky stuff of the material world doesn't do it for us as much as we once thought it did. We're moving away from it. And this is when spiritual life actually starts to settle in at a deeper level, when we don't have to struggle so much to keep ourselves from doing what we shouldn't do. We're just not attracted. And this is described in Bhagavad-gita, Vishaya vinivartante niraharasya dehinam raso varyam rasopiyasya param drisvarnavartate. A person may be restricted from the objects of the senses, but the taste for sense objects remains. But ceasing such engagement by experiencing a higher taste, one is fixed in consciousness. So the higher taste eventually comes, but it's a struggle in the beginning, there's no doubt about it. And so that's kind of, we have to go through that. And at a certain point, then eventually we become naturally attracted to what's actually going to be beneficial for us, beneficial for all the people we're in the circle of, beneficial for humankind in general, beneficial for the environment, and beneficial in the long run for everything and everybody. Other questions? Yeah.
So one of the most popular translators of Indian scriptures is Ramesh Manoan, and he translated the Srimad Bhagavatam. And apparently he, well, the first thing is he describes many like sexual encounters between Krishna and the gopis. Is that true?
Oh, we're getting right into the meat of it all here, right away here. Yeah, there are many people who put Krishna and the gopis in the context of kind of really sort of lewd encounters, you know, which is actually completely wrong. The Prabhupada used to tell us that there is iron and there's gold. And both are metals, there's no doubt about it, but there's a difference between iron and gold. So, from our mundane view of things in the material world, we generally think of sex life as the highest thing. You know, that's generally how modern people look at things. And even from the Vedas, we see that the sex attraction is called adiras. It's the original and the greatest of all material pulls or attractions in the world that we live in. And there's no doubt that this colors the way we think. And in the material world, because we're doing all this barter system for getting our sexual and our emotional needs met, we automatically assume that when we read the stories between Radha and Krishna, or Krishna and the various gopis, that this must be what these stories are actually about. But actually it's not true. There is a resemblance, there's no doubt about it. You know, there's a resemblance. But one thing we should understand is that Krishna, one of his main qualities is he's Atma. He is the source of pleasure, not only for himself, but for everything and everyone else. So he's not attracted to the bodies of the gopis, because in a very real way, he is the body of the gopis. So there's nothing there that's attracting him from our usual carnal understanding of things. Rather, what's going on there is Krishna is savoring the dedication of the gopis. And that's the thing that Krishna is really trying to go for. Now, in the beginning, it may be hard to understand that. But as you start to think about this philosophy in a deeper way, you begin to realize that what does the Supreme need? You know, it's like the Christmas gift, you know, what do you give the man who has everything? So God is truly the man who has everything. So what do you give to such a person? And the one thing that you can give to the Supreme is your love. And that love can be in various levels. It can be very deep, or it can be somewhat shallow. And this is what we have that we can give to the Supreme. And that's what the Supreme actually wants. He doesn't need it, but he wants it because we're all pieces of him. We're all particles of him. And when we interact with the Supreme in a favorable way, giving ourselves to him, then he enjoys and we enjoy. But there's always the alternative, to forego that completely and search after our own dream. And so in the material world, we try to do that. And oftentimes we see that people who are commenting on the Vedas, because they are not devotees, they see things from a mundane viewpoint, and they understand things in a sort of practical, literary, everyday sense. But to understand the Vedas, you can't see everything solely from a, practical, everyday, mundane sense. You have to actually have a spiritual sense of what's going on there. And so this kind of interpretation is not new. There's a whole class of translators and even philosophers in India called the Prakriti Sahajias, who have for hundreds of years given this type of understanding of the gopis. And in fact, their entire spiritual process is all about sex life, but we don't see that, again, like we were talking about, many interpretations. This is not a viable alternative, not a viable interpretation, because what happens when you think of things in that way and you live a life based on a philosophy like that, you discover you're not becoming more happy. You discover that you are not becoming actually peaceful. You are doing things which cause anxiety and anger and frustration to others, and you're also degrading the environment. This is the nature of what happens when you follow a philosophy that doesn't really get it right. So there are these kind of interpretations out there. So everyone's got to weed through them and decide whether this interpretation actually makes any sense, or it will be a viable interpretation, or it'll be one of these interpretations that will put your ship on the reef at some point in your life. Yeah.
And for what it's worth, this translator calls the gopis gypsies.
Was that gypsies? Yeah.
That's how he translates it.
So he's not the first one. I mean, this is the kind of thing that has happened for a long time in the history of Vedic understanding. But one can try to read the Vedas and try to understand them from his own viewpoint, but we suggest that the Vedas really should be understood from a descending point of view, to get it from higher authorities, from people who not only read the Vedas but live the Vedas. If you were going to translate a book from, say, German to English, if you knew German and you knew English, you could probably do a pretty good job of it if it was just about some everyday subject. But what if you were talking about electronics? So if you were translating a book from German into English, and you knew German and you knew English, but you didn't know electronics, what kind of interpretation would that be? It's the same thing here, that you can explain what's going on in the Vedas, something that is written in a language called Sanskrit for the most part. You can explain that. You may know Sanskrit and you may know English. But if you don't also understand the nature of the philosophy being talked about, then your explanation will be like trying to translate a book on electronics from German into English, and being competent in German and being competent in English, but not being competent in electronics, the subject matter. Does that make any sense to you? And unfortunately, that's what these kind of commentators are like. They know the Vedas, they've studied them themselves, but they're not living the Vedas. And they may know Sanskrit, and they may have some familiarity with the trends, the fashions, the history, the culture of the ancient Indian system. But since they're not actually living the philosophy, they don't understand the deep meanings behind things. They only understand the superficial forms, and that's what you get, you know. So when a person hits these things for the first time, they take some time to digest and to see if, you know, the person like me who's explaining them is actually just weaving some kind of, you know, smoke screen or some kind of philosophical trap, or whether I'm actually speaking something that has some solidity or substance to it. So you have to work your way through it. And again, there are many interpretations. But not every interpretation is viable. Not every interpretation is equal. Not every interpretation will get your boat through the straits and not wind you up on the reef. So that's what I have to say. Yeah, behind you there.
I'm wondering, since it's a battle of, you know, evil among the people and, you know, goodness and piousness, I wonder if Bhagavad-gita is helpful, and the main thing is helpful for us to understand our present circumstances, and, you know, it will be useful for us to understand the Bhagavad-gita in terms of causes, you know, that need to be formed.
I'm having trouble hearing.
In terms of what?
Causes. In terms of
Causes.
what needs to, you know, you need to fight for things, you know, oppression and animal abuse and things like this. Will this be helpful to just
Can anyone rephrase the question? I can't.
I can.
Okay.
I think I understand it. I think the question is, what are some practical? How can we practically apply the Bhagavad Gita to modern day?
Understand that you come from a spiritual place, and that you know, aim to be bound, to be binded to the supreme, and yet, you know, be able to fight causes like, you know, animal abuse, oppression of people.
Right. Well, there are many problems in the world. One just has to see the news, you know, to see that all the different things that are going wrong. But they all have one cause, and that's the key. You know, you can try to chase all the symptoms around, but all the problems in the world boil down to one formative, single root cause, and that cause is the lack of focusing on the Supreme and the focus on one's own selfish interest. That's what causes all the discord of every type in the world. And we can know that, but we won't be any good at making any dent in that unless we ourselves betake ourselves to the spiritual process. That's the only thing that will actually change the outside world and us as well. And so first we have to clean up our own backyard. And the best way to do that is the spiritual process. And just knowledge is not enough. It's a start, but knowledge is not enough. We have to actually engage in what we call sadhana, or everyday activities that purify our lives and our consciousness. And then we become the change that will eventually have an effect on the entire world. We don't need to come up with some new philosophical or political scheme or sociological implementation. What we need to do is simply purify ourselves. And if we do that, that itself will have an effect on other people, and it'll certainly have an effect on us. And certainly teaching is an aspect of it. But just knowledge, as I say, isn't the whole thing. The whole thing is to not only have knowledge, but knowledge that we do apply in our lives. Like we avoid meat eating, intoxication, illicit sex, and gambling. We chant every day. We try to do service. We try to get used to the idea of doing things and not expecting any return. All these things are kind of out of the ordinary for everyday mundane material life. But if we do them, we will solve our own problems, and we will also be helping others to solve their problems. And we will certainly not be adding to the aggregate of dysfunction in the world. Is that your question, or did I just miss the point?
Well, Arjuna has been asked to fight, and he has to fight his kid,
Right.
his family, the human family. And, and the thing is, I understand Arjuna went 12 years in the forest.
Yeah.
What I am trying to say is, will the example of Arjuna really help us fight things? There's a lot of things going on in the world.
Yeah.
And, should we really be fighting, or should we just really be observing our spiritual nature?
Right.
Would we will not be, approaching, and really tackling the problems, be good. And just okay, so just go chanting and studying.
Well, our real fight is an internal fight. If we win the internal fight, the external fights are a piece of cake. They don't really do much, But the problem is we don't fight the internal fights. We'd rather fight them outside, which is a lot worse, and it doesn't really help us that much, Because everything that we experience as human beings is seen through the filter of our own outlook. And that's why in Milton's Paradise Lost, it says, the mind is a thing of itself. It can make a hell of heaven or a heaven of hell. Mm. So everything in our world is filtered through our own perceptual framework. And so that's why, someone like this Franco, who was in a Nazi concentration camp, could have a rosy outlook on life, as opposed to someone who's living in a penthouse somewhere, who is thinking about suicide, So really, the world as a chessboard is filtered through our own way of looking at things. And that's why spiritual life is so important, because we begin to realize what is the proper attitude to filter the whole world through. And when we do, then a lot of things don't matter. And we begin to see that the real fight is internal. We have to fight our own bad habits, our own tendencies to be obsessive about things that don't matter, and so forth. That's our own fight. I was going to bring that up, so I'm happy this question came up. That was my next segue that I was going to go into. This idea that, what is this idea? Arjuna is fighting somebody. And who is he fighting? He's fighting somebody he doesn't want to fight, his relatives, So this is our position. We're in a position where we have to do battle with things that we would rather be comfortable with as opposed to battle them, And this is the whole idea of gradually winning the war by small positive steps. So through every day trying to do the right thing, every day trying to chant and listen to our repetitions of the holy name, through every day trying to do service and not expecting anything back, through every day bathing our intelligence in the philosophy of spiritual life, we are becoming purified. And the more purified we are, the more we can do good for others in a genuine way, not in a way where we're just trying to impose our ego on them, not in a way where we're just trying to play one up with them, not in a way where we're trying to do what's good for them, but we don't honestly know and we're messing their lives up, So this is the nature of spiritual life. If your consciousness is clear, then the Supreme can act through you. And to make it clear, we have to gradually become purified of the three modes of nature. I don't want to get into the details now of what that is, but this is what Arjuna's being asked to do by Krishna in an overall perspective. And this is where this metaphor of the Bhagavad Gita reaches into our lives. We're not being asked to fight a battle, per se in a war somewhere against some other combatants also in military attire. We're being asked to fight an internal battle against our own past, our own bad habits. And if we can win that battle, at least my own experience in life is, if you can win that battle, the other battles are not a big deal. They're not a big deal. We'll be kicked around by the world some way or another anyways, And the more we're concerned with the material world being a specific way, the more specific we are about how we want the world to be, the more we suffer. When we start giving up that sense that the world is going to be some way we intend for it to be, the better off we are in the long run. And we begin to look and expect those things which are not in the category of how we expect the world to be, but rather how we hope that we will be and how we hope we will see the world. So if you have very little, but you're in a very spiritual, conscious state of mind, you'll feel happy. If you have everything in the world, but you're in a totally material consciousness, you'll be miserable. So it doesn't matter how much you have, and it doesn't even matter so much what the external circumstances are. What matters is what your internal condition is, and that's how you will see the world, and that's what also will make the big difference on whether you can affect the world in a positive way, or you'll affect the world in a neutral way, or affect the world in a negative way. So we are just trying to become more purified. Does that answer your question? Am I in the right sort of ballpark? I want to get the question hand back.
I'm a bit conflicted about bhakti. So if bhakti is the message that Sri Krishna wanted to give Arjuna, he surely wastes a lot of time on jnana and karma and yoga, because the Bhagavad-gita mostly goes through those.
It does in the first 6 chapters.
Right.
You got 18 chapters, that's only a third of it. And it just goes through 1 chapter on each one of those things, As I said, Arjuna is no dummy. He's a soldier. But although in the Vedic times soldiers did get military training, they also got philosophical training as well, which we don't do in our military in the modern day. But they did back then, So he had philosophical training. And Krishna knew that unless he actually could bracket all those things that Arjuna had previously assimilated in his philosophical training, and then move on into new territory where he wanted Arjuna to be, that Arjuna would be lost. And we see that for 1 chapter, 1 chapter, 1 chapter, 1 chapter, we hear about these various yogas. And then for 6 straight chapters, we just hear about bhakti yoga. 6 straight chapters, he's just talking about bhakti yoga from 7 through 13. And we can see that this is really the message of Bhagavad Gita. It may seem strange to us that Arjuna showed his devotion by shooting arrows. Generally, we don't think of devotion coming out in that kind of a manifestation. But this is exactly what Krishna had wanted, because he knew that Yudhishthira was the right person to rule, and he knew that Duryodhana was not. And he knew that Duryodhana was very selfish, and he was very materialistically inclined mentally, and that he would make people around him the same way. So that's why Duryodhana could not be reasoned with. Duryodhana could not be placated. Duryodhana could not be bargained with. So that left argumentum ad bacillum, as we say. There was only one course left. And if you read the whole Mahabharata, you see that the war was the last of all, like 20 attempts that were made to broker the situation in some other fashion. And finally, all those other attempts failed, and there was only one recourse left, and that was, of course, the battlefield. And so Krishna didn't start out with the idea that Duryodhana had to be eliminated. Krishna himself went to try to broker a peace between the Pandavas. They were prepared to accept a fractional part of the kingdom, just so long as they had some part to rule. They didn't demand the entire kingdom. But because Duryodhana was so self-obsessed, he was not even willing to cede that much, that Krishna finally said, okay, there's only one thing left with this guy. There's only one approach we need to go. And he can't be bargained with. He can't be reasoned with. He can't be emotionally affected by anything we have to say. There's only one recourse left, and that's why it came to the battle. And Duryodhana wanted it. He wanted the battle because he wanted to be rid of the Pandavas. He thought he could do it. Of course, again, Duryodhana has one point of view. Yudhishthira has another point of view. The end of the battle of Kurukshetra, what happens to Duryodhana? He's dying with his thighs broken after a battle with Bhimsen. And what's happening with Yudhishthira? He's the king of the whole world at that point. So, again, you have those kind of things. Does that kind of help answer your question? Any other questions? We've got a little bit of time before we go our second kirtan.
I was going to make a comment on your question. Krishna was not just speaking to Arjuna. He knew that this was going to be read by so many people. This was to be known. Had he just concentrated on bhakti, those people who were inclined towards gyan or to karma would have put the book down right away. Therefore, he presented gyan and karma. Oh, he's speaking about karma. I'll listen a little more. Oh, he's speaking about gyan. His idea was to bring as many people in so that he could present the conclusion. And therefore, he spends that time there.
Yeah, that's actually another part of it I hadn't thought of.
It's just in terms of the overall picture, bhakti would be 80%, and you do karma and jnana.
Right.
5-10%.
Many presenters do present it as Krishna is offering all these alternatives. That's the way they present Bhagavad-gita. But if you read Bhagavad-gita, I mean, I'm not making it up, go to chapter 6, at the very end of chapter 6, you'll see Krishna is not saying, Arjuna, whatever you think of these, various alternatives, you choose that. He doesn't say that. Instead, he says, what is it, karmebhyo, something, tapas yogi, he's actually saying that the yogi is better than the karmi. So he's already saying that. He's saying the yogi is better than the tapasvi, the person who's performing austerities. The yogi is better than the jnani. He's saying that. He says, so be a yogi. That's the next to the last verse in tapas vibhyo diko yogi. That's how it starts, So that's the next to the last verse in chapter 6. And the last verse is... out of all yogis, the best one is one who always thinks of me, which he's describing a bhakti yogi, not a meditative yogi or a physical yogi. He's talking about a bhakti yogi, which means a person who's serving him. So Krishna is quite clear about that. But many commentators, they ink that through. They create smoke around it so people won't see that part of it. But it's there, I'm not making it up. And any version of Bhagavad-gita that actually has the Sanskrit in it, you'll see that these verses are there. Krishna is clearly making a distinction. So we're getting ready for our second kirtan. Thank you all very much for your good questions. And we'll do a quick kirtan, and then if there are any further questions, we can discuss after when there's prasadam being served out.
Yeah.